really kind of the last week where it's kind of tedious bringing a lot of different information together, information that really has not been presented before in this format. Thank you so much, Jeff. I appreciate that. All right, so let me bring my screensaver share up here. All right, I'm just going to verify that we are sharing and that we are good, and then we'll jump right in. All right, I see it up there. Okay, so this week we are going through page 546, and let me see. Here we go. All right, my computer has to think a little bit since I have so many programs open. Okay, so the first thing that we find, now last week, let me just recap last week real quick. We covered Hatshepsut. We saw that in the early Egyptian empire that Egypt was plagued by internal affairs. They had some internal coups. They had Nubian threats in the far south that really turned their attention south. The Hittites also had palace intrigues and attempted assassinations, and this kept both the Hittites and the Egyptians very much focused on rebuilding their own kingdoms, on their own policies and their domestic matters. Hatshepsut, the female queen, was focused on reestablishing international trade that had been usurped by the Hyksos during the second intermediate period. So the Egyptians were focused on kingdom building and reestablishing the administration, whereas the Hittites were trying to maintain this vast territory they had very recently conquered. From this, we have a resurgence of the Hittites. We also have Mitanni, who comes into the area, and they become this kind of a balancing force to the north of Syria in that region. We find also, we had covered last time through both the first and second conquest campaigns. You know, the traditional view is to see the conquest as this one event that took place, you know, within 5 to 7 years. And although it is true that that the Israelites did indeed conquer the whole of Canaan, they toppled impregnable fortresses. They did not always hold on to the territory that they had conquered. A lot of times they simply did not have the population to do that. Many of their forces, their army had died in the wilderness. So when they came into Israel, they were a much smaller population, and they had to really work to maintain the territory they had conquered. Now, one of the policies that Israel had embraced, and this was in direct contradiction to the instructions God had given to Moses and the instructions that God had given to the nation of Israel. He had told them not to treaty, not to make covenants with any of the local population within Israel or within the land of Canaan. The Israelites ignored this. And as Judges 1:28 states, that when Israel became strong, rather than driving them out of the land as they had been commanded, they put the Canaanites to tribute. This proved to be a very disruptive policy. It's the same thing as keeping terrorists in your land and allowing them to go exist beside you, just simply because you can have a source of tax revenue. This, again, is not a policy that is conducive for a peaceful society. Israel really didn't understand this back then. They were really all about the money at this point in time in their history. And this is the, after about 60 years on the land. Oh, thank you, Stephen. I appreciate that update. After about 60 years on the land, God really kind of tires with Israel's policy of covenant making. And you find that there is this incident at Shechem. It's a word play on Shechem. It is now called Bochum, because where Israel had covenanted when they came into the land. Remember, Shechem formed Israel's first capital city. Shiloh was kind of an administrative district within Shechem. And it was at Shiloh or at Shechem, where Israel came every 7 years to recovenant before YHWH. This is where they would spend their jubilees. This is also where Israel's scribes came to update the nation's archives. So you find later within the Song of Deborah that both Zebulun, Manasseh, many of the tribes housed scribal schools for Israel. And these probably would have been Levite families that were distributed within the tribes of Zebulun and Manasseh. But what you find, the landmark event in Judges 2, is that God tells Israel he will no longer fight for them. He will no longer fight on their behalf. So we'll just read this real quick. This is Judges 1-6. It says, "And the angel of YHWH came from Gilgal to Bochum, and he said, I made you to go out of Egypt, and I have brought you out of the land which I swore to your fathers. And I said, I will never break my covenant with you. And you shall make no league with the inhabitants of this land. You shall throw down their altars, but you have not obeyed my voice. Why have you done this? Wherefore I also said, I will not drive them out from before you, but they shall be as thorns in your sides, and their God shall be a snare to you." This is a quote from Numbers 33, 55-56, if you guys want to look that up later on. It says, "And it came to pass when the angel of YHWH spoke these words to all the children of Israel, that the people lifted up their voice and they wept. And they called on the name of that place Bochum, and they sacrificed there to YHWH. And then when Joshua had let the people of Israel go, everyone went to the inheritance of his possession." Stephen, I am on page 531, but very quickly we are going to go to 533. What I did is I kind of organized the material for tonight's class into categories so it's easier to cover, kind of cover the same range of material all at once. So at Bochum, this idea of breach and of weeping, we find that God is no longer fighting on Israel's behalf. Now, I wanted to run down the chronology of the early Exodus because I think this really helps us to see the timeline of events as they happen. So I believe you guys can see my handy dandy mouse as I roll it on the screen here. I'm going to move it over here and make sure you guys can see it. The Exodus occurred around 1548. They come into the land around 1508. And then you find around 1503, Caleb receives his inheritance. If you come down to 1594, there is this second release year and this redistribution of land once again. This coincides with Thutmose I. We do know that he had some campaigns in Syria. He did not meet any opposition at this time, which really tells us that Israel was focused on the interior of Canaan. They had made it as far as Shechem, and they really had not progressed towards the Mediterranean in their campaigns. Thutmose's campaigns were along the Mediterranean. We will see that later in the class tonight. There was really kind of this traditional Egyptian campaign route that most of the monarchs in Egypt followed when they campaigned in Canaan. We have 1487, we have the third release year. This would have been the 21st year of Israel upon the promised land. And then 1480, this probably was recorded in Joshua 24 and in Judges 1, this covenant renewal that Israel does. And then in 1478, Joshua dies. This is when the second intermediate period begins. We really don't have any good archives, any good record keeping in Israel for about 12 to about 20 years. There's just really this lapse of interest in keeping administrative archives. Perhaps Israel is focused on building homes. They're focusing on establishing communities in a functioning way during this time. And archives are just not their priority at this point in time. Then we come to Bochum. And Bochum occurs right at 1466 BCE. This would have been the sixth release year of Israel upon the promised land. And you find that shortly thereafter, Israel falls into captivity to the Mesopotamian king, who the Hebrew text called Cushan-rishathaim. Now, this is probably to be identified, as we will see in a moment, with Kadashman-harbe of Kassite Babylon. And we're going to see why there is a correlation at this point in time. But fascinatingly, you do not find this association later on during the Ramesside times. There is absolutely no invasion by any Mesopotamian, Assyrian, Babylonian power during the Ramesside era. So this is a real challenge to later datings of the Exodus. But we do have an invasion right at 1460. The Jubilee occurs in 1458. This is the first Jubilee on the land. Right at the 50-year period. And then in 1452, Othniel arises to save Israel from the oppression levied by the hand of Mesopotamia. And then he rules over Israel, or he administers Israel as a judge for 40 years. At the end of this 40 years, we're going to find that Thutmose III becomes a power and an authority in Israel after the death of Hatshepsut, and he begins campaigning in Israel. We'll also see that when he begins to campaign in Israel, it coincides with a period of rebellion for Israel. So these things don't just happen out of the blue. There's actually kind of a causal and effect where Israel's covenant is concerned during this period. So the Kassites during this period, this is right around 1531, all the way down to about 1450. They had conquered Babylon, and they were really able to conquer Babylon because of the Hittite invasion and their weakening of the land. By the time we get to the Babylonian invasion of Syria, the northern parts of Canaan, they really had expanded to this gray shaded broken line area is where the Babylonians had expanded. Now, the reason why would the Babylonians have any interest whatsoever in invading northern Syria? Well, we find from some early Babylonian tablets, inscriptions, that the Setuans who occupied northern Syria had raided, they had invaded the outlying Babylonian territories. And there was this call for justice, this call for retribution, which Babylon did. So this is the campaigns against the Sutu is what it's called in Babylon. And I'm just going to read this. This is from Chronicle P. The most significant event in his reign appears to, this is of course referring to Kadashman-harbe the first. It says the most critical event of his reign appears to be an aggressive campaign against the Setu, a nomadic people along the middle Euphrates related to the Arameans. It is described in Chronicle P in a somewhat gargled passage that superimposes events relating to the ascension of Kuriagazu II 4 generations later. He claims to have annihilated their forces, then constructed fortresses in the mountain regions he called Hihi, the Syrian desert, as securing outposts, and he dug wells and settled people in fertile lands and strengthened the guard. These events seem to be confirmed in the opening 6 lines from an unpublished Kaduru, which is a boundary stone, in the Yale Babylonian collection, which describes his efforts to expel the Setuans from Babylonia. Now, again, the Setuans were people from the Levant who had settled in the outlying territories. They had raided Babylon, but they really occupied right along the Levant. And this is what occasioned the invasion. And what does Babylon do once it invades the land? Well, it's going to put the locals there, the people of that region, to tribute. Now, according to the scripture, this tribute only lasted for 8 years. Egypt was very weak. We don't really have any contest whatsoever from Egypt at this time, contesting Babylon's claim to tribute during this time period. Now, I just wanted to go over the various conquest campaigns during this time. And this is going to cover a period from 1508 all the way down to 1412 BCE. The first conquest campaign occurs under Caleb and Joshua. It occurs from 1508 from 1478 BCE. The second one lasts until 1460. And this is the elders who outlived Joshua until the third generation of those that had come into the land. So this is very early in Israel's history on the land. Right around 1460, Israel falls captive to Cushan-rishathaim. And again, it is only about 10 years off from the time that scholars date, from when they date Kassite Babylon and Kadashman-harbe the second. So, or rather the first. So it's right around the same time. The third conquest campaign occurs under Othniel's leadership from 1452 all the way to 1412. So this is the period of time that we are going to be dealing with today, although we are going to get down into Thutmose's invasions of Canaan as well. So we're going to go all the way down to 1394 today. Thutmose II reigned, traditionally is ascribed 1469 all the way down to about 1415. There is speculation as to the exact reign for him, partly because his reign is eclipsed by his stepmother Hatshepsut. We're not really sure of the duration of the times that their reigns overlapped in co-regency. It appears that his son, Amenhotep II, was also a co-regency with his father. So not knowing how many years those overlapped, we're really left with a little bit of speculation. We do know that Israel fell into captivity as Israel's vassal from 1412 to 1394. And as we will see, this just so happens to coincide with an 18-year period. You know, Israel's captivity to Moab is 18 years. Israel's captivity, or rather Egypt's invasion and campaigning within Canaan is also an 18-year period. So there very well may be an association between Moab's captivity of Israel as a vassal, whereby they put Israel to tribute, and Egypt coming into the land and demanding tribute. So we do see some strong associations during this time period. Again, it's very possible that Thutmose III reigned much later than what he is traditionally given credit, and he may have had a co-regency with his son. So Thutmose III and Amenhotep II, they began their Transjordan campaigns very late in his reign. After his stepmother's death, there was a lot of hostility that Amenhotep and Thutmose displayed towards Hatshepsut. She was almost considered this usurper. All of her memorabilia was effaced. Thutmose went to extraordinary lengths to defame her, to mar and erase her image throughout Egypt. So there was some sort of hostility, some sort, and you know, and this is very uncharacteristic of Egypt, because it really didn't matter the coup that took place in Egypt. You could have one king who killed his predecessor. He would still go to extraordinary lengths to preserve his predecessor's memory and memorabilia throughout the land of Egypt. So this is something that is really uncharacteristic. There was obviously some reason for this hostility between Thutmose and Hatshepsut. Now, it appears that late in Hatshepsut's reign, Thutmose may have installed his son as co-regent. But what it appears is that when they campaigned in Canaan, they very well may have campaigned together. Now, scholars do view their campaigns as separate. They do not view them occurring at the same time. When I studied this era and I studied the campaigns, I found it very ironic, and let's go forward here, that the campaigns of Amenhotep just so happen to match the campaigns of his father, of Thutmose III, beginning in Thutmose's 32nd year of reign. It's just uncanny how many associations and overlap we see between their campaigns. Now, the years of oppression, and this is my personal hypothesis, that this is not one that I have seen scholars embrace as of yet, but I am putting this forward simply because it does help to explain the period of oppression that we see by Moab and explain Egypt's campaigns within the land of Canaan. So we see that Israel's oppression begins right around 1412 with Thutmose III first campaign into Canaan. And this time of oppression does not end until right around 1395 with both Amenhotep and Thutmose's last campaign into Canaan. At this point in time, Egypt really reverts to empire building, into monument building. Their forces are no longer focused on conquest or on obtaining tribute. Rather, they return very peaceably to the arts. So this just gives you an idea as to the association and to the chronology of one possible scenario that may have existed during this time period. So one of the questions that you always face when you put Israel in Canaan at a very early date is that why there is no mention of Egypt anywhere within the books of Joshua or Judges. You know, if Israel were in Egypt and we know Egypt campaigned in Canaan, why is it that we have no record of it? We know that Thutmose III conquered the very cities Israel had overthrown during the initial conquest. Some of these cities had a short gap, like Megiddo. They had a short occupation gap, but within about maybe 20 years, they rebuilt and they were a flourishing trading center once more. So why is it Israel's scribes are totally mum, they're totally silent where Egypt is concerned? Now, this is a quote from page 532 in Yahweh Exists, and this regards covenant and scribal protocol. And I'm just going to go ahead and read this. You guys can read along with me. The scribe's pen highlighted Israel's obedience to Yahweh's commands or her rebellion to it. This naturally dictated the scribe's fixation on the peoples whom Yahweh had commanded Israel to expel from Canaan, to the exclusion of all others. Since Canaan's indigenous population would be the source of conflict, a political situation quite similar to modern Palestinian relationships today. So you find that Yahweh's covenantal law had forewarned, those which remain of them shall vex you. Egypt was not a land that was given to Israel, nor were the Egyptians a people she had been commanded to drive out. From the scribe's perspective, Egypt was irrelevant. If Israel obeyed the command to cleanse Canaan, Yahweh would protect her from Egypt's forces, and no one would desire her land. If Egypt, Babylon, or Assyria subjugated Israel's people, she had rebelled against Yahweh's covenantal law. Now, this is important because Egypt never occupied Canaan. Egypt didn't have the manpower to totally subdue Canaan, but what they did have were the Canaanites. So every time Egypt came in and they exacted tribute from Canaan's populations, it was always done through her natives. It was done through Megiddo. It was done through Hatzor. It was done through the tribal federations that had existed before Israel's conquest of Canaan. So these people, these societies, these city-states became henchmen for Egypt, and these Canaanites were leveraged against all the local population. So had Israel driven these people out of Canaan, then Egypt would have had no administration, no local forms of government to leverage against Israel. So this is why Yahweh's command was very important. Now, I want to point out that the scribes' exclusion and the scribes' ignoring of foreign entities is not relegated to the Judges era. Later during the monarchy, we also see that Israel ignores foreign invasions when it is really not directed solely at them. When Ahab went against Assyria, we are not even told that Assyria was part of that invasion. All that we know from 1 Kings 22 is that Ahab went to war with Syria, and the account almost makes it sound as though Syria and Israel were at war. What we know from Assyrian archives is that Ahab actually came as an ally to Syria against Shalmaneser and the king of Assyria. I know these names can be confusing because they sound very much alike, but Assyria was closer to Babylon, whereas Syria was located to the north of Israel, where modern day Syria is located today. So you find that this alliance is not recorded in scripture as an aggression whereby the opposing force was Assyria. That is really totally ignored in the same way that Egypt is ignored. Now, later on, when you have a direct campaign of Shoshank under Rehoboam that comes against Israel, well, that is at that point that then you find the direct military offensive is recognized, and you find that Assyria's military offensives, when they are directed at either Israel or Judah, they are mentioned. But where they are directed at another people, and they really are not directed at Israel, it is not always recognized within Israel's historical archives. Now, the one thing that I found that is absolutely fascinating is that the cycle of obedience and rebellion that we have during the Judges era. You know, Israel obeys for a while, they are free, they have this autonomy, they don't have to pay tribute to a foreign nation. But then they make these treaties with the local Canaanites, and then they are subdued and they wax weak, and then they have to pay tribute to a local henchman, and part of that tribute is given to Egypt. But what is fascinating is that each of these invasions by Egypt coincides with a time of rebellion, a time of captivity for Israel, all the way until we have the Philistine invasion right around 1200 BCE. Now, Tutmosis III's Trans-Jordan campaigns, they had many different purposes. During the early conquest, all the way until about 1450, and I see that I have lost, there is an error. Let me see what happened here. I'm not really sure what happened. Let me check and see why we are not broadcasting. I am fine here on my end. But I see that there is an error. So let me see if there is a trouble with bandwidth. All right, stick with me here for a minute, guys. I'm going to unshare for a moment, see if it will come back on. I'm not sure why we had this error. But Let me see what YouTube is telling me here. All right. Give me just a minute. I'm still broadcasting. What I have on my screen is that there is an error that occurred. All right. Can you all still see? I guess you can see me now. I'm going to go ahead and screen share again. Do we still have sound? And can you see the screen? If you can, I will just continue on and assume that the error occurred from just in my own browser. So at this point, I now have showing Thutmose III's Transjordan campaigns. Is that what you all see? Just give me a thumbs up if that's what you're seeing right now. And then we will continue on and just pick up where I left off. It just disappeared. Okay. Okay, see, that's what I'm afraid of. I'm not really sure why this happened. What we may have to do is open a new link. I am not sure. This appears to be a YouTube problem or a problem with my computer. Has it come back on yet? Let me, I'm going to open this again in another tab and see if I can catch this. So bear with me just a minute, guys. I just want to make sure that you guys are, okay, you can hear me, you can see my logo. Okay, so let me try sharing this again. I'm not sure why it's not sharing. Okay, well, this has actually disappeared. Okay, so let me bring this up. There's always some issue, it seems, with technology, right? When you think you have it down pat, something happens. All right, I'm going to share it again. See if it comes back up. Okay, I see that you can see me. Okay, you guys still hear me? All right, I think it's going to come back up. Yeah, well, the reason that I said that, there is about a 30-second delay. Sometimes it's about a minute. So I actually saw the problem before you guys did. So I'm not sure if the problem is with my memory, but okay, I see that it's back up. So I'm going to continue on at this point. Let me see if you guys can see. Okay, you're seeing the entire thing, so that's good. Okay, so I'm going to just jump back in. So Thutmose III's Transjordan campaigns, his whole entire reason for invading Canaan during this time was this vacuum that the Hittites had created. With Egypt being so focused on rebuilding the kingdom and rebuilding their economy, the northern parts of Canaan began to ally with Mitanni. And by this, they began paying Mitanni tribute. They began massive fortifications, anticipating Egypt's invasion. Mitanni, on the other hand, promised these tribal federations protection from any invading force. They were kind of the protectorates of the northern area of Syria and Aram. Thutmose came also because Mitanni had tried to usurp Egypt's international position as the global trading partner of the world. So Egypt was not willing to let this go. So they came and they enforced trade and treaties for trade. They enforced it militarily. That means they come in and they say, we're going to invade you, we're going to deport you, we're going to conquer you if you do not trade with us. So this was really the main offensive and the main reason for Thutmose's invasion into Canaan. While he was there, he's going to loot the land. He's going to establish his network of tribute throughout Canaan so that he can support his troops, so that he can again make Egypt the superpower that it was. So, and now, of course, Egypt receives Canaan's tribute, and Egypt becomes Canaan's protectorate at the end of this point, where there is a stalemate where the Hittites and Mitanni are really repulsed, and there becomes this line of armistice where they no longer are able to invade any. The Mitanni is no longer able to invade any further south. Now I see Stephen says, okay, you can't see it. Okay, can you see? You can see it now. Okay, if there's any errors, just let me know, and we'll kind of play this by ear. I'm not exactly sure what's going on. I had an error on one of my channels, but not on both of them. So, okay. So what we find is that Tutmosis during this point, during this era, was both a friend and a foe to Israel at the same time. He was a friend because Tutmosis captured and deported Israel's enemies in Canaan. Many of the territories that Israel could not conquer for herself, many of the territories that Israel put under tribute, Tutmosis actually conquered and deported those cities. But then Egypt was also a foe because he deported rebellious Israelites. The Egyptians termed them Haparu or Hebrews. So it was a universal term at this point in time. In fact, you know, as I mentioned before, Tutmosis did indeed help Israel probably as much as he hurt them. He helped them by both taking the rebellious people out of Israel. You know, when you have a nation and they're not willing to abide by law and order and to do things constitutionally, if you have an invading force that really just extracts your troublemakers of your own people, that is almost more of a help than it is a hindrance. Now, after Joshua's death, and we're just going to look at some of the comparisons here, we do find that Manasseh did not drive the inhabitants of the land, but he put them under tribute. We find this in Joshua 17:11 through 13. But this is where it gets interesting. Manasseh's territory specifically was inhabited, or rather it covered the territory of Basher and Bethshan, Ablim, Dor, Tanuk, Endor. All of those were cities of Manasseh. Well, it's interesting that Tutmosis, when he invades Canaan, the cities that he targets are really, most of them are Manasseh cities. So in Ablim, he deports 43 people. In Tanuk, he deports 42. In Megiddo, he deports 340. Now, notice above where it talks about Megiddo and her towns, even 3 countries. Well, these 3 countries are also mentioned in Tutmosis' stele. They are mentioned as Yanom, Nugis, and Hareku. So all of these territories coincide. So we don't really find this type of geopolitical situation later on under the Ramesside era. It's really broken down. It's not as strong of a confederation, but this confederation totally fits the historical scenario right around 1412, 1420 BCE. Now, what were some of the territories that Tutmosis attacked where Israel was concerned? Well, Tutmosis tells us that he attacked a territory known as Joseph El and a territory known as Jacob El. You know, scholars tell us that these names have no correspondence whatsoever to Israel. These names just happen to be Canaanite names within the land of Canaan. And the Hebrew or the Aparu just happened to be people that were living in Canaan at this same time period. I find this too coincidental to be refuted if we know that Israel had conquered the land in 1508, it makes perfect sense that you have a northern territory within Shechem area, perhaps north of Shechem, that would have been termed Josephel, and a southern section of Canaan that would have been termed Jacobel, where the Israels primarily had settled and where they had established a base for their military operations as they continued to campaign across Canaan. Tutmosis also tells us that he deported 3,600 Aparu, and he had deported 15,200 Shasu. Now, the importance of this is that notice how the disproportionate numbers of Aparu that he deported in comparison to the meager peoples that he deported of Eblim, Tanakh, Megiddo. This is really disproportionate. What this shows is that the Haparu were causing trouble in Canaan. They were warring. They were being troublemakers. They were trying to subjugate Pharaoh's tax-paying populace. And because of this, he deports very large numbers out of Canaan. The Shashu are also, we will see later on, many of these were also probably Israelites. We will see next week that Israel retained a very Bedouin-like existence for a good 300 years on the land. It really wasn't settled permanently for a very long time. And there were certain tribes within Israel that maintained some sort of shepherding Bedouin existence all the way until the fall of the monarchy in 587 BCE. Some of them just adapted it as a lifestyle that they were comfortable with. We'll investigate that more next week. But we will also see that Ramesses, a good 150 years later, would term these Shashu as the Shasu of Yahovah. So this again shows some correspondence to the Bedouin type people that were living on the land and the invasion of Tutmosis. Now, why was Israel deported? It's very interesting that one of the facets of Israel's curses, or the stipulations for breach, stated that if Israel rebelled, that Yahovah would bring them back to Egypt again by ships, by a way that Yahovah said they would never again see. He tells them that you will be sold to your bondsmen, to your enemies, as bondsmen and bondswomen, and no man shall buy you. This concept that no man shall buy you meant they would have been working for the state rather than being sold to individuals. This would have been a state-sanctioned and a state administrative type of slavery, usually a corvée type labor where you worked for a pharaoh and you were really never free to be your own man and to work for yourself, to build your own trade and to build your own business. Part of the year you worked for pharaoh, part of the year you worked for yourself. This was the very system by which God had rescued Israel, less than 100 years before. Now, what is fascinating with this statement is that when Tutmosis and Amenhotep, when they invaded Israel and they deported them back to Egypt, they indeed deported Israel in ships back to the land of Egypt. So that's the irony there. If you look at this map, this shows you some of the deportations that occurred. Some of them took place around Nera, and they were, and then also near Megiddo was another port city that you had, and they were deported back into Egypt. So one of the last things that we're going to look at this evening is the evidence for Israel in Canaan around 1420 BCE. This object that you are looking at is called the Berlin pedestal relief. It has been studied by many scholars. The primary scholar that has studied this has been Peter van der Veen, and he reconstructed this broken name ring, is what it's called, because it is broken. But when he reconstructed it, about 4 or 5 scholars agree with him that these are the only reconstructions that are possible. And what this name ring spells in Egyptian hieroglyphics is the name Israel. So this dates to the time of Tutmosis III, and we know this for several reasons. It mentions Canaan in this within the larger corpus of the pedestal relief, and it is spelled by a short spelling. Um, Tutmosis III was part of the 19th dynasty. When that dynasty ceased to exist and you had the 18th dynasty arose about 150 years later, the 18th dynasty is what Ramses II was part of. They really, under the 18th dynasty, they really instigated and instilled a lot of new scribal practices. The scribes began spelling Canaan with a much larger spelling. Under Tutmosis, everything was spelled consonantally, the way it is done in ancient Canaanite and Paleo-Hebrew. Once you get to the New Kingdom with the 18th dynasty, or the 19th dynasty, all of a sudden the 19th dynasty begins using vowels in addition to consonants. So you find that there's a lot of renaissance in Egyptian literature, a renaissance with their language that occurs during the 19th dynasty that did not occur in the 18th dynasty. Rather, the 19th dynasty under Ramses really enjoyed all of the military successes that had been established by Tutmosis and his predecessors. You also find one thing that is controversial with this is that the name Israel in ancient Egyptian hieroglyphics, they did not have a lamed, the L in the ancient Egyptian language, but rather they would substitute a hieroglyph for R. We find in Egyptian hieroglyphics relating both to Jerusalem and to Ashkelon, the lamed in both of those names during the period of the 18th dynasty under Thutmose, those are used with the Egyptian hieroglyphic for R to represent the EL element of those names. So what this is important, and the reason this is important, is that it shows Israel was in the land much earlier than what scholars traditionally ascribe. Now, James Hoffmeyer, an Egyptologist, has criticized this translation because Israel in this name ring is written with a sin instead of a shin. This is basically the difference between the s sound and the sh sound. However, you have to kind of wonder if we're splitting hairs with this criticism, because even in ancient Israel, we are told that not all of the ancient Israelites could pronounce the sh sound. When there is the civil war in Israel, we are told that the Gileadites, they blockaded the Ford and Jordan, and they established a password of Sibosheth. This is in Judges 13. And the reason they use the word Sibosheth is because not all of those in Israel could pronounce the sh sound. Some of them could only pronounce a simple S sound. So the question remains, you know, what part of Israel's forces had Egypt or Tutmosis' garrisons come in contact with? If it had been one of the northern tribes that could not pronounce the SH sound, then it would explain why we have an unconventional S sound in this name ring. Again, it really isn't something that I see is worth splitting hairs over. There's enough evidence that we have to restore this as the name of Israel. So just to, let me go forward here. Whoops. Okay, hold on. Let me see what happened here. I have to go through this very quickly here. Sorry about this, guys. It jumped on me. Okay, so just to recap the evidence that we have for Israel in the land of Canaan, much earlier than scholars traditionally ascribe. We have destruction of almost every fortified city in Canaan around 1500 BCE with an occupational gap. Most of these cities show a gap in occupation of at least 500 to 700 years. Now you have sites like Megiddo and Hatzor, Tanakh, Bet-Shan, where the occupation was only somewhere around 20 to 30 years, and the nations or the cities rebuilt. You also have the destruction of Amorite cities on the east side of Jordan. There is no reason for any entity anywhere in Assyria, Babylon, Hittites, Egyptians. No one had a reason to conquer the territory of the Jordan Disk. It had no military advantage. It had no economic advantage. So the only plausible theory is that Israel destroyed them as part of an ongoing effort to establish a homeland and to establish a territory in which to live. Another fact is that Sharhuin did not exist after 1500 BCE. And we have the reference to Sharhuin as part of the conquest campaign. As soon as you get to the Ramesside period, the city is no longer referred to, and you have it really plays no part in Egyptian history whatsoever. Another factor is that equine burials are no longer used for foundation deposits, and they're really not even used that much for sacrifice as much as they had been. And this may show an Israelite influence on customs of the day. YHWH had prohibited donkeys and horses from being valid options for sacrifice, and he also deemed them unclean. So this would have deterred use of them within the Canaanite territory, and we can't say what type of influence Israel would have had. The other influence that we have is, or the other evidence that we have for Israel in Canaan, is that there was about 100-year era, actually it was closer to a 16 era, where there was no invasion of Canaan. Israel was, the land of Canaan was totally peaceful, and Israel had the opportunity to establish a nation. Although it's a very small nation, it is still a start. If you look at America and how we started out with the small 13 colonies, and we expanded to the 50 states that we are today, it is absolutely amazing when you consider Israel in kind of that same parallel, where they had their original colonies, they're around Shechem, and they expanded outward both north and south. They never really conquered until the monarchy. They never really conquered the Mediterranean sea coast. That came under the monarchy simply because they just simply were not strong enough. They didn't have the greatest population, as well as the fact that they never followed YHWH's plan, his conquest campaign plan, or his policy to not covenant with them. The other thing that we have, the other factor that aligns with both the Judges' history as well as the history of the greater Babylonian Hittite era, is that of Kadashman-harbe the first, which aligns with Cushan-rishathaim. You know, when you come to the Ramesside era, we have no record of anyone invading Canaan whatsoever. In fact, Ramesses had such a strong hold on Canaan, it would have been impossible. So it really brings into question a 12th century Exodus date. Egyptian invasions coincide with Israelite captivity. We will continue to see this in future classes. And Tutmosis deports Hebrews right around the same time that we know Hebrews are there. So the fact that he would deport an entity that bears a name that is phonetically equivalent to the word Hebrew also brings up the question and evidences the fact that Israelites were in the land of Canaan. And the last thing is that we have a name ring bearing the name of Israel, as well as we have Tutmosis referring to cities he conquered of Joseph-el and Jacob-el. So all of these factors are very strong evidences for Israel being in the land of Canaan at a much earlier date. Now, next week, we are going to look at some of the policies, contemporary warfare practices, as well as contemporary customs that Israel shared with both the Canaanites and the Egyptians that only fit this very early period of Egyptian history. Once you come to the Ramesside era, you find a lot of these customs fall into disuse, both in Israel as well as in Egypt. So that's going to be part of next week's class. And then we are going to transition into some of the early part of the 19th dynasty. So it's going to be a fun topic. We're also going to discuss the Amarna tablets that have record Israel's ongoing campaigns within the land of Canaan. So at this point, I'm going to open it up for questions and comments. I've enjoyed having you all here this evening. This is always fascinating, and I'm going through this in detail because I want to make sure this is new material that really has not been written or explored elsewhere. So I want to really supply a very strong and firm foundation for this material so that hopefully it is not confusing, but that it makes perfect sense. So any questions or comments at this point in time? I'm going to actually go back and take it off the screen share here. And let me see here. All right, so there we are. So any questions or comments? This material, for me, I don't know about you, it is fascinating to see the parallels between Egyptian history as well as Israelite history, and to see the parallels between Babylonian and Israelite history. So I see that there is quite a lag, a good, I would say 45 seconds between what I am broadcasting and what you guys are seeing. So I'm just going to talk a little bit and wait for you guys to catch up. And if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to post them. I hope we are not stalled out anywhere. Let's see here. All right, yeah, I see that we are there and we are broadcasting. So any questions or comments at this point in time? I've enjoyed having you guys with me. I always enjoy discussing this information. And I do invite you guys to Roots of Faith tomorrow morning, 10:30 a.m. And I believe Ross is broadcasting. He may be taking the day off. I'm not exactly sure if he's taking the day off tomorrow or if there'll be a live broadcast. Okay, you can still hear. That's good. Any questions or comments? If not, we will call it a night. And I will look forward to seeing you guys next week. You know, there was a lot of material and kind of bringing it together. Let me also point this out real quick before we go. The chronology that I am presenting regarding Tutmosis, Amenhotep, and their invasions into Canaan, both their reigns, their co-regency, is not one that is embraced by traditional scholarship. This is really a theory that I am advancing. I have seen one or two scholars mention it, but it is just not mainstream. Maybe as the evidence is considered, maybe hopefully it will become mainstream as the years progress and as the information is considered by more scholars regarding this era. All right. Well, if there's no questions or comments, I will bid you adieu and wish you a wonderful evening. Thank you guys for joining me. Shabbat Shalom.